time, which was with a general discussion of social categories. Sorry about that. Doesn't seem to be helping much. Anyway, social categorization ought to be a fairly straightforward kind of thing. Roger Brown, when he tried to identify natural categories of persons, came up with fairly straightforward concepts like sex and race and nationality and the kinship that on the surface look very straightforward, but when you start thinking about them a little bit, it turns out not to be so straightforward. So, for example, it would seem to be the most natural thing in the world that you divide people up into sex, male and female, and that categorization would tell you an awful lot about them. But it turns out it doesn't tell you that much at all. You've got to take into consideration not just biological sex. You have to take into consideration gender identity. You have to take into consideration gender role. You have to take into consideration sexual orientation. And pretty soon you've got not 2 categories pertaining to gender, but you've got, in principle, a couple hundred categories pertaining to gender. And that's kind of the way things go. And there's a rule here, which is that the boundaries between various social categories are not all that clear, and also that the nature, the very definition of social categories can change from time to time and from place to place. Let's just remind ourselves what we're talking about here. There are lots of different kinds of social categories. We're going to talk mostly in these set of lectures about classes of persons, which are typically represented by noun terms like male or female, man or woman. Okay. We have also categories of social groups, which I'm going to talk about mostly on Monday, but I hope to talk about psychiatric diagnoses today. But there are also categories of situations. If somebody invites you to a particular kind of party, for example, you don't really know what goes on there, they'll try to describe it in terms of something you already know. If you get invited to your Jewish roommate's little brother's bar mitzvah, and you say, well, what's that? He might say, well, it's kind of like a christening, or it's kind of like a confirmation ceremony, or it's kind of like quinceañera, or something like that. And that kind of gives you the idea that it's a kind of coming-of-age ceremony, and you kind of know what to expect. Okay? We also classify actions, especially social interactions, in terms of the categories, and that gives us this whole big vocabulary of trait adjectives. We classify some behaviors as instances of aggression, other behaviors as instances of friendliness, and so on and so forth. And we also have a related set of categories that pertain to social interactions. Again, we're going to focus mostly in these lectures on categories of persons, but I want you to be just kind of be aware that categorization goes from soup to nuts in the social world. It's not just people we're classifying; it's behaviors and situations and all sorts of other things. Okay. Here's another one of Roger Brown's natural categories of persons, classification of people into occupations. If you go and take a sociology course on social stratification, or you take an epidemiology course on social class and health, you'll typically see a ranking of socioeconomic status like this that takes into account people's occupations and their level of education and their level of income. And sociologists will commonly classify people as white-collar or blue-collar. They'll classify white-collar employees as professional versus managerial, sometimes sales. They'll classify blue-collar employees as skilled versus unskilled, and so on and so forth. That's a fairly obvious scheme of classification of people by virtue of their occupations. And if somebody says, well, I'm going to introduce you to this person, he's a professional, you have some idea what to expect. Your expectations may be frustrated or disappointed in various ways, but by virtue of identifying the person with a category, you have some idea what to expect. And again, although this is the kind of the classification of occupations that scientific sociologists and economists tend to prefer, there are all sorts of other classifications by occupation that you encounter that are culturally specific. So there's nothing natural about these categories. If you move to another culture, you might get an entirely different classification of occupations. A good example of this is the caste system in Hindu India, something that is technically illegal now in India, but still a prominent feature of Indian social life, where you have at the upper end of the occupation categories Brahmins, who are typically priests and scholars, and then down at the bottom untouchables and all sorts of levels in between. Again, this is how in Hindu India, especially traditional Hindu India, you would classify people, and it doesn't look very much like the kind of occupational categories that we get from sociologists. Okay, political categories, same way. You go home for the holidays and your mother asks you what your roommate's like. You say, well, we're not really getting along because he's a Democrat or whatever. Again, labeling people, classifying people as Democrats or Republicans, neoconservatives versus paleoconservatives, and so on, provides information about that person. What it says is you can expect this person to be like other people who belong in this class. And again, I just want to point out that the nature of these social categories is not given once and for all. The distinction between liberals and conservatives didn't exist until roughly 1780 in the West, and it's changed a lot since then. The distinction between neoconservatives and paleoconservatives didn't begin to emerge until the 1960s or 1970s, and it's a distinction that you really only find only in American politics. You won't find it in British politics, you won't find it in French politics, or any place else. And of course, times change. Communists used to be a big political category, now not so much. Okay, so again, these are not given once and for all. These are very fluid kinds of categories that change from time to time. Nationality, the categories is another really good example. How would we divide people up in sensible ways, classifying them according to nationality? Very often you'll find a fundamental distinction between people of European origin and people of Asian origin, but we make distinctions between Western and Eastern European individuals, between Northern and Southern, more Germanic, more Italian, between Anglo-Irish and Continental. The Anglo-Irish sometimes don't even consider themselves European because they're not on the continent, and there are certain Europeans, like the French, who don't consider them European either for exactly that same reason. Again, point of view makes a big difference in terms of how you slot people into categories. Here's one I was discussing with people at the end of the last class. The whole question of defining somebody as Jewish or not Jewish is one that turns out to be pretty interesting and pretty difficult. You'd think it might be fairly straightforward, but it turns out not to be. Traditionally, Jewishness is defined in terms of matrilineal descent. If you're the child of a Jewish mother, you're Jewish. But people do convert to Judaism, and it turns out it makes a difference whether you have a so-called Orthodox conversion or a non-Orthodox conversion. A point I'll return to in a moment. But Orthodox Jews won't consider anybody who's converted to Judaism a Jew unless he's had an Orthodox conversion. Okay. Similarly, you can convert from Judaism. It happens sometimes that a Jewish person will become Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or something like that. But again, in Orthodox doctrine, as long as you're the child of a Jewish mother, you're still Jewish, no matter what your religious belief is. There's the issue of the so-called lost tribes of Israel, like the Ethiopian philosophy. Masha, an issue that comes to a head in Israel because of the Israeli law of return, which gives any Jewish person the right to emigrate to Israel. These are Ethiopians who claim to be Jewish. They practice Judaism, and they claim their right of return. And then there is the question of whether Judaism is a religion-based classification or an ethnicity-based classification. There is a fascinating case in the British courts right now of a young man who's known as M to protect his identity, his privacy. In England, there are several thousand religion-based public schools. Okay, that is, there are schools that cater to members of a particular religion, but which receive public financing. Okay, that's just the way the English have organized their system. And M is a practicing Jewish young man, child of a Jewish mother, who applied for admission to one of these religious schools that is organized for Jews. He was denied admission to the school because his mother converted to Judaism when she married, but she didn't have an Orthodox conversion. So the school denied that M was Jewish, because his mother wasn't Jewish, as far as they were concerned, even though M practices as a Jew. It's not just that he identifies as a kind of cultural Jew, the way some of us identify ourselves as cultural Christians, but he actually is a practicing devout Jewish person. And that denial led the British court system to say, hey, wait a minute, we're willing to make an accommodation for religion, but we're not willing to make an accommodation for ethnicity. And if you're going to define who's a Jew by virtue of descent instead of by religious belief, then you've got Judaism being an ethnic category, not a religious category, and these schools don't deserve any public support. So again, how you categorize these things makes a big difference. Those of you who had introductory psychology with me know that there's a famous American Supreme Court decision that classifies a tomato as a vegetable. Okay, because we think of it as a vegetable, even though it's not a vegetable, right? And there it is enshrined in this law, the Supreme Court decision from the 1880s, that tomatoes are vegetables, not fruits. It kind of seems silly at the time, but it's the same kind of question is being raised in this particular British court case. It's quite interesting. Here's another example, the question of who's French. In French constitutional law, anybody born in France or born in a French territory until very recently was considered French. And that's all you are in France. France doesn't make any further distinctions. In France, they don't have any idea how many Frenchmen of African descent there are, or French Muslims, or anything else, because France doesn't allow that kind of classification of people. But this idea that there's one kind of Frenchman and all Frenchmen are equal is really quite extreme. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, both of whom were born in former French territories, Bill Clinton born in Arkansas, Hillary Clinton born in Illinois, were eligible to become presidents of France. Okay, just kind of imagine that for a second, because that's the definition of the French. As soon, by the way, as soon as the French found out that Bill Clinton was eligible to become president of France, they changed that law, and it's not true anymore. But here's your kind of prototypical French president, Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, get it? Charles the Frenchman, right? Who's the president of France now? Nicolas Sarkozy is a Hungarian, right? But because he was born in France, he's considered a Frenchman. Right now, there's a big controversy in France about the wearing of the hijab, the headscarf, by devout Muslim women. And somehow, many French policymakers are very unhappy about this because it seems to be making distinctions among the French, right? And somehow, if you want to wear the headscarf, you're not as French as other people who don't want to wear the headscarf. You're setting yourself apart or whatever. So much so that France has now banned the wearing of the headscarf in certain public places, a kind of radical thing. But again, the point here is that it's not completely clear who's French, right? And it's not completely clear how you get to be the French. These social categories are not like whether you're a fish or a bird or whatever, or are they? A question we'll come back to in a couple of minutes. Here's another one, hits a little bit closer to home. What's an American? American political ideology has usually been based on this idea of the melting pot. This is the play by Israel Zangel that term that comes from. That somehow people come to the shores of America, whether they're Hungarians or Frenchmen or black or white or whatever, and we're all kind of put in this God's crucible, the melting pot, and out comes a blend in which everybody's lost their individual identities. Well, not so much anymore. We have a number of racial or ethnic groups who are arguing that there's not just one kind of American, there are lots of different kinds of Americans, and instead of being one big melting pot, American society is more of a mosaic or a rainbow or a stew or something like that. This point of view on what it means to be an American turns out to have certain kinds of consequences for people. There are now two political ideologies at play in American society. One which we could call assimilationism, which emphasizes the idea of America as a melting pot that tries to get rid of differences between people, and the other one, a kind of multiculturalism that tries to celebrate differences and encourages members of different ethnic groups to retain their identities and their traditions and things like that. Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, two sociologists writing in the 1960s in their book Beyond the Melting Pot, drew attention to the fact that melting pot is kind of an ideology in American society, but it didn't really happen. And there are now a bunch of alternate American metaphors that have been proposed. Nathan Glazer, writing 35 years later, says we're all multiculturalists now in the United States. Well, we're not all multiculturalists, that's for sure. But in American society, the debate between assimilationist ideology and multiculturalist ideology is very much the same kind of debate over what it means to be an American that Israelis have over what it means to be a Jew, and that Frenchmen have over what it means to be a Frenchman. Here's a recent work by Victoria Plaut, who's a professor here up in the law school, looking at what she calls diversity climate in various kinds of organizations. She went into a large organization with a number of different departments and assessed the white people the white employees in this department about their views about assimilationism versus multiculturalism. Do you believe that people should erase their ethnic differences when they become Americans, or do you think that America should celebrate ethnic differences? That's kind of a dimension of belief. And classified whites into either multiculturalists, people who think you ought to encourage and celebrate ethnic diversity, or whites as colorblind, people who think that they ought to erase all these differences. Then Professor Plaut went to minorities employed in these same departments and looked at their psychological engagement with the firm. That is the amount of positive feeling they have with the firm, and also their perceptions of racial and ethnic bias. And it turns out that minorities in departments where the white people tend to hold multicultural views are a lot happier and a lot more engaged in the firm, whereas minorities in departments where whites tend to want to diminish ethnic differences tend to perceive a lot more bias and be a lot less psychologically engaged. So again, how you think about this question has consequences not just for you, but also has consequences for other people around you, and how comfortable they're going to be. Okay, so let's now take a look at these kinds of racial and ethnic classifications that we have in the United States. And again, there's kind of a straightforward way of thinking about this. We tend to classify people as white or black, as Hispanic, as Native American, as Asian. What's interesting about that is classify people as Asians. You glom together people who really don't see themselves as similar at all. South Asians, East Asians, and Southeast Asians, and then Pacific Islanders are kind of in there as well, and that includes Native Hawaiians and so on. But let's just look at how the official racial and ethnic classification in the United States has changed over its history by looking at the racial and ethnic categories employed in the United States Census. For 60 years, from the first census in 1790 until 1850, the census made really only 3 distinctions. First, it's a distinction between white and black. Those are the terms used in the census. And if you were black, there was a further distinction between those who were free and those who were slaves. This is before the Civil War, obviously. But for the next 3 censuses, 1850 to 1870, you got a somewhat different kind of racial and ethnic classification. First, there's a white or black, but now there's a subcategory of blacks known as mulattoes for people who are partly white and partly black, reflecting the interests of the westward expansion. Now American Indians enter the census for the first time. Now let's be clear. There were American Indians back here too, right? But nobody cared about them then. Okay, it was only with the westward expansion that became a social category that people wanted to use. And there was a further distinction between Indians who were taxed, that is, Indians who did not live on reservations, and those who weren't. Chinese was added to the census in 1960, and Japanese was added to the census in 1970. There were Chinese and Japanese in the United States before then, but they weren't officially counted in the census. In 1890, we get something different. Here are the categories then. Again, these are exactly the terms that the census used. Whites versus blacks, and blacks were further classified as mulattoes, 1 white parent, 1 black parent, quadroons, 1 black grandparent, and octoroons, 1 black great-grandparent. Again, you can see how race becomes very, very, very important in post-Reconstruction the United States in a way that it wasn't before. We're making all these distinctions about black folk, but we're not changing the distinctions about American Indians or Chinese or Japanese. In 1910, all those black distinctions disappear from the census, and we add Asians for Asians who are not either Chinese or Japanese, and we add Pacific Islanders for the first time. Why 1910? The Spanish-American War, right? Okay, Spanish-American War. We got Philippines. We got the Philippines. So we had and some other territories as well. So now we had to start counting the Pacific Islanders, and the story kind of keeps going. We had Mexicans for the first time in 1930, and we do that because there was a program known as the Bracero program, which brought Mexican laborers across the border to work in farms in the Midwest and the Southwest, and they started having children. So we wanted to know the census wanted to know how many people of Mexican heritage we had. Mexican gets changed to white Hispanic in the 1940 census. It's not clear why they did that, but they did it. Adding Filipino as a separate category in 1950. Why 1950? World War II is over. A lot of Filipinos emigrating to the United States. And then for the first time, we have a category of other race. Not clear what that's supposed to mean. 1960s, we start counting Eskimos, Aleuts, and Hawaiians for the first time. Why? 1958, Alaska and Hawaii enter the Union as states. Okay. 1970, we start counting Koreans separately. And a very interesting thing starts to happen with people of Spanish descent, however you might think of them. The census has never been able to figure out how to categorize Americans of Hispanic origin. We saw earlier a category of Mexican, then that was replaced with, there it is, white Hispanic. Okay. Now they try out this one, Spanish language or heritage. You know, so if your native language was Spanish, or you considered yourself to be of Spanish heritage or Spanish origin or Spanish descent, you were supposed to check that category. Of course, that covers a multitude of different kinds of people and really obscures distinctions that you might think would be very interesting, like the distinction between Cubans and, for that matter, people who came from Spain and Mexicans and other Central and South Americans. They stuck with that for the 1980 and 1990 census, but now we added more refined categories of Asian and Pacific Islanders for 1990. And then finally, in 2000, we get a bifurcated racial and ethnicity question. Again, the census trying to figure out exactly how to count Hispanic people in a way that is both accurate and meaningful to Hispanics. Here, in the 2000 census for the first time, the question was broken up into 2 questions. First, you had to say whether you were Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino. And then, regardless of your answer, you had to indicate your race. And the reason for this was it wasn't the old census made it very difficult for Hispanics who also were of African American heritage to show that. Here again, we get the term African American being used for the very first time. Now, what happens in the 2010 census, the one you're going to complete in a couple of months? The question is framed pretty much the same way, except now the order of these things is reversed. The Hispanic community didn't want Spanish first, okay, because that's Spain and that's the old world and all of that. So now it's Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, and then you indicate your race. And for the first time in a long time, in fact, I think for the first time ever, the term Negro was placed in the census, which got the African American community all up in arms. But the reason they did that was that in the long form of the 2000 census, large numbers of older African Americans didn't want to identify themselves as either black or African American. They wanted to identify themselves as Negroes, so they're able to do that in the 2001 census. Notice now the proliferation of other categories of